lock your doors, turn on all the lights, and listen closely. This is The Midnight Visitor, a Christmas nightmare in the woods. How one festive season turned into a nightmare they could never forget. This story will take you deep into the heart of fear, where the silence of the forest hides something far more sinister than snow-covered trees. The Johnsons, Mark, his wife Sarah, and their 10-year-old daughter Emma, were excited for their Christmas getaway. Mark had found a rustic cabin online, advertised as the perfect retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. It was nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no Wi-Fi or cell service. The drive to the cabin was peaceful. Snow blanketed the forest, and icicles hung like decorations from the branches. Emma was thrilled, pointing out deer tracks in the snow and chattering about building the biggest snowman ever. When they arrived, the cabin was as charming as the photos had promised. It had a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, a small but festive Christmas tree in the corner, and a view of the endless woods through the large windows. The first day was perfect. They spent it decorating, baking gingerbread cookies, and drinking hot cocoa by the fire. But as the sun set on Christmas Eve, an unsettling stillness settled over the cabin. The kind of quiet where even the wind seems afraid to blow. After dinner, as the family sat by the fire, Emma wandered to the window to admire the snow. "Dad, there's someone outside," she said suddenly, her voice a mix of curiosity and fear. Mark and Sarah joined her, peering out into the darkness. At the edge of the tree line, barely visible through the falling snow, was a figure. It was tall and motionless, dressed in dark, ragged clothing. "Probably a hiker who lost his way," Mark said, though his voice wavered slightly. "I'll go check." Mark slipped on his coat and boots and stepped outside, the cold biting at his face. He called out, "Hello? Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. Mark took a few cautious steps closer, but before he could get too close, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. Confused and slightly unsettled, Mark returned to the cabin. No one was there, he told Sarah, though he chose not to mention the way the figure had vanished so abruptly. As night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful wail. The firewood crackled loudly, and shadows danced on the walls. Just as they were settling in for the night, the power flickered. The lights dimmed and then went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Mark grabbed a flashlight and checked the breaker box, but everything seemed fine. "It's probably the storm," he said, though the weather outside was calm. Then came the first knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A gentle tap-tap-tap on the living room window. Mark shone his flashlight toward the window, but there was nothing there. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked nervously. Before Mark could respond, another knock came, this time louder, from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Mark cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer. He opened the door a crack, shining his flashlight into the snowy night. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. The family tried to ignore the strange occurrences and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, Emma woke her parents, her face pale. "Someone's walking on the roof," she whispered. Mark and Sarah listened closely, and sure enough, there it was, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps, like boots crunching against the snow-covered shingles. Mark grabbed the fire poker and climbed the stairs to the attic, but the noise stopped as he reached the top. When he opened the attic door, the cold hit him like a slap. The small window was wide open, snow blowing in. He quickly shut it and locked it, but as he turned to leave, he heard a low whisper, so faint it could have been the wind. "Let me in." The knocking resumed, now frantic and coming from every side of the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the house, filling every corner. Emma screamed, pointing to the living room window. The figure from earlier was now standing just outside, its face still obscured. Mark rushed to lock the door, but before he could, the handle began to rattle violently. The man outside let out a guttural, inhuman growl that sent shivers down Mark's spine. "Stay upstairs," Mark yelled to Sarah and Emma as he blocked the door with a chair. But then, the sound of footsteps came again, this time from inside the house. The family huddled together, terrified, as the footsteps grew louder and closer. The figure now appeared at every window, its face pressed against the glass, revealing empty, black eyes. Mark knew they had to get out. "Grab your coats," he whispered. "We're leaving now." They rushed to the car, but the engine wouldn't start. The figure appeared again, this time just feet away from the car. Its arms were unnaturally long, its fingers clawed and twitching. The family screamed as it slammed its hand against the window, cracking the glass. In a desperate move, Mark grabbed a flare gun from the trunk and fired it into the air. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek and vanished into the woods, leaving behind only the sound of the wind. When dawn broke, the family was found by a passing ranger, huddled together in the car. They told their story, but the ranger shook his head. "That cabin's been abandoned for years," he said. "Everyone who stayed there has seen things." The Johnsons never returned to the woods. They sold their cabin reservation and spent every Christmas after that in the city, where the only visitors were friends and family. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some visitors should never be invited in. The next time you hear a knock in the dead of night, think twice before you answer. Because not all. Tonight, I'll share a story of Christmas cheer turned to terror, a tale of voices that refuse to fade, of a cursed tradition that haunts a small town every year. So, grab a blanket, sit close, and prepare yourself for the haunting carolers, voices that never fade. The town of Pine Hollow was idyllic, especially during the holiday season. Snow blanketed the streets, icicles hung from rooftops, and festive lights adorned every home. But at the edge of town, a dark and ancient forest loomed like a shadowy giant. Claire and her younger brother, Ethan, had recently moved to Pine Hollow after inheriting their late grandmother's Victorian house. The house was beautiful but unnervingly isolated, standing just yards away from the forest. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the woods, warning newcomers to avoid it, especially on Christmas Eve. But Claire dismissed the talk as baseless superstition. On Christmas Eve, as the town celebrated in the square, Claire and Ethan stayed home. Their grandmother's passing was still fresh, and they weren't in the mood for festivities. Instead, they lit a fire, sipped hot cocoa, and tried to create their own quiet celebration. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, they heard it, a faint, melodic sound coming from the direction of the forest. "Do you hear that?" Ethan asked, lowering his mug. Claire paused, straining her ears. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer, a hauntingly beautiful melody carried on the winter breeze. Voices, harmonizing in perfect unison, sang a carol neither of them recognized. "It's just carolers," Claire said, trying to sound dismissive. But her tone betrayed her unease. "At this hour? Out in the woods?" Ethan whispered. Claire stood up and peered out the window. The forest loomed dark and silent, the snow untouched. But the singing continued, growing louder and closer. "It's probably just some kids playing a prank," she said, grabbing her coat. "You're not seriously going out there?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide. Claire hesitated but nodded. "I just want to see who it is." "Stay here?" Of course, Ethan refused to stay behind, and together, they ventured into the freezing night. The air was crisp, the kind that stung your lungs with every breath. The siblings trudged through the thick snow, the flashlight in Claire's hand casting long shadows across the trees. The singing guided them deeper into the woods, growing louder with every step. But something was off. The snow around them was pristine. No footprints, no sign of anyone who could have been singing. And yet, the voices were unmistakable, as if the carolers were standing just ahead. "What kind of carol is this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire didn't answer. The melody was haunting, almost hypnotic, and the lyrics, though indistinct, seemed to carry an unshakable sadness. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a group of figures, their backs turned to the siblings. The figures were dressed in outdated clothing, long coats, scarves, and bonnets that looked centuries old. Their heads were slightly tilted, as if listening for something. Claire raised the flashlight, her breath catching in her throat. "Excuse me," she called out. "Are you lost?" The carolers turned in unison. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty and lifeless. Their mouths moved, singing the same mournful melody, but no sound came out. Instead, the air seemed to vibrate, as though the song was being carried on a different plane. Ethan grabbed Claire's arm. "We need to go," he whispered urgently. But it was too late. The carolers began to move toward them, their footsteps silent on the snow. The melody grew louder, almost deafening, though their mouths barely moved. Claire's fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. She turned and ran, pulling Ethan with her. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ran. The trees twisted and loomed, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out. The singing followed them, echoing from every direction. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a presence, oppressive and suffocating. Ethan tripped, falling face-first into the snow. Claire helped him up, but when they looked back, the carolers were gone. The clearing was empty, the woods silent once more. Breathing heavily, the siblings made their way back to the house. But as they approached, they froze. The carolers were standing outside the house, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Panicked, Claire and Ethan locked the door behind them and pulled the curtains shut. "What do they want?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Claire didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed an old journal she'd found in the attic earlier that week, her grandmother's. She flipped through the pages until she found a chilling entry. December 24th, the carolers came again tonight. They sang their curse song, and we lost another. They lure you with their voices, take you into the woods, and you never come back. They're not alive. They're not human. They're trapped, and they want to take others with them. Claire's hands shook as she read the final line aloud. If you hear them, don't follow the song. Don't look at them. Hide. As if in response, the singing resumed. The carolers surrounded the house, their song muffled by the walls but still impossibly loud. The windows began to rattle, and the lights flickered. Ethan grabbed a candlestick, his eyes darting around the room. "Salt," Claire shouted, remembering another detail from the journal. "They can't cross a line of salt." They scrambled to create a barrier around the house, pouring salt along the windowsills and doorways. The carolers' faces pressed against the glass, their lifeless eyes staring straight at Claire and Ethan. The house shook as the melody reached a crescendo. It felt as if the walls would collapse, as if the carolers' sheer willpower could break through the barriers. But just as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the singing stopped. The house fell silent. Claire cautiously opened the curtains. The carolers were gone, leaving behind only faint, melting footprints in the snow. The siblings never spoke of that night again. Claire burned the journal, hoping to sever the connection to the past. But every Christmas Eve as the clock strikes midnight, she hears it, the faint, mournful melody drifting through the trees. And she knows the carolers are still out there, waiting for their next audience. Not all Christmas tales are filled with joy and laughter. Some remind us that the past is never truly gone and that the spirits of the season can carry dark intention. It was Christmas Eve, and Emma and her boyfriend Jake had rented a cozy cabin deep in the woods. It was their first holiday alone together, away from the chaos of the city and the noise of their families. The cabin was picturesque, decorated with string lights and a beautifully adorned Christmas tree standing proudly in the corner of the living room. The snow fell gently outside, blanketing the forest in a serene white. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the couple sipped on warm cocoa, laughing and exchanging small gifts. Everything seemed perfect. But as the clock struck 10, something shifted. The air in the cabin grew heavy, and the once cheerful atmosphere felt oppressive. It started with a faint scratching sound near the back door. "You hear that?" Emma asked, setting her mug down. Jake frowned. "Probably just a branch against the door. The wind's picking up." But Emma wasn't convinced. The sound wasn't rhythmic like a branch swaying in the wind. It was deliberate, calculated, like someone or something was trying to get in. Jake got up to check the door, but when he opened it, there was nothing there. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone or anything. "See? It's just your imagination," he said, locking the door again. But Emma couldn't shake the unease. As they settled back into the couch, she noticed something odd: the Christmas tree. One of the ornaments, a small glass angel, was swinging gently, as if it had been touched. "Jake, did you bump the tree?" she asked. He shook his head. "I haven't been near it." The scratching sound returned, louder this time, and it was coming from the living room window. Slowly they both turned to look. Through the frosted glass, they could just make out a dark shape standing motionless in the snow. "What is that?" Emma whispered, gripping Jake's arm. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the window. But the beam of light revealed nothing. The shape was gone. Trying to shake off the fear, they decided to call it a night. Jake went upstairs to grab some blankets while Emma stayed behind, tidying up the living room. As she bent down to pick up a fallen gift, she froze. From beneath the tree, she saw it, a shadow. It wasn't from the tree or the ornaments. It was darker, more distinct, and it was moving. "Jake!" she screamed, backing away from the tree. Jake came running down the stairs, his face pale. "What's wrong?" "There's something under the tree," Emma stammered, pointing. Jake grabbed a poker from the fireplace and cautiously approached. But as he reached the tree, the shadow darted out, moving impossibly fast and disappearing into the hallway. "What the hell was that?" Jake muttered, his voice shaking. Emma was trembling. "We need to leave." "No." Jake tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard he pulled or twisted the knob, it was as if the door had fused shut. "Windows," he said, running to the nearest one. But they wouldn't open either. The couple was trapped. As they stood in the living room, trying to figure out what to do, the lights began to flicker. The fire in the hearth dimmed, and the room grew unnaturally cold. And then the shadow returned. It slid along the floor, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. The air was thick with an unexplainable dread. "What do you want?" Jake shouted, his voice echoing in the silent cabin. The shadow stopped. Slowly, it rose from the floor, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. But its face, or where its face should have been, was a void, an abyss of darkness. The shadow raised an arm, pointing toward the Christmas tree. The glass angel ornament that had been swinging earlier shattered suddenly, the sound piercing through the silence. Emma screamed, clutching Jake's arm. The shadow seemed to grow larger, its form towering over them. The lights flickered violently, and the fire went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Jake swung the poker wildly, but it passed through the shadow as if it wasn't there. "Emma, the matches!" he shouted, remembering the box on the table. Emma fumbled in the dark, grabbing the matches and lighting one. The tiny flame illuminated the room just enough to reveal the shadow recoiling slightly, its form quivering. "It doesn't like fire," Emma realized, grabbing a candle and lighting it. The shadow shrank, retreating toward the tree. With the candle in hand, Emma approached the shadow. "Get out," she shouted, her fear giving way to anger. The shadow seemed to hesitate, flickering as if it were losing its form. But then, it lunged, knocking the candle from her hand and plunging the room back into darkness. Jake grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, aiming it at the shadow. The beam of light caused it to writhe in pain, its form distorting and shrinking. "Keep it on the tree," Emma said, grabbing another match and relighting the candle. Together, they focused the light and flame on the shadow, forcing it back into the corner where the tree stood. The shadow let out an unearthly shriek, its form dissolving into wisps of black smoke. And then, just like that, it was gone. The the lights stopped flickering and the fire reignited on its own. The oppressive cold lifted, and the air felt normal again. Emma and Jake didn't sleep that night. They sat by the fire, keeping every light in the cabin on until the first rays of dawn broke through the windows. When they finally opened the door to leave, they found something chilling on the front porch, a single blackened ornament, identical to the one that had shattered the night before. They left the cabin that morning and never returned. Not all Christmas traditions bring joy. Some shadows are better left undisturbed, and some gifts are best left unopened. Remember, the true spirit of Christmas may not always be the one we expect.